New resident to Glastonbury, John Crow, who's an amazing playwright, poet, speaker, and he is going to be talking about his transformational experience of coming from living in London to being in Glastonbury, and how it's all again connected to the Grail. It seems that everything's connected. We should have called this the Grail conference, shouldn't we? No, I like the Legend conference because these guys are legends. Let's give it up for John. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor. Quick disambiguation, I think is the new word they use, isn't it, on Wiki. So I'm billed, of course, as John Crow, and I've been known under that name for probably the last 30 years or so in my magical life. That's how I operate. But I published my work under the name I was given, my birth name, John Constable, like the painter. So if any of you are really inspired by this talk to go deeper into my work, some of which is available over with Roma at the desk, it's John Constable. He's not pretending to be me. Or maybe he is. Or maybe I'm pretending to be him. It's complicated, isn't it? Identity. And identity, of course, is a big part of the Grail, because the Grail is all about relationship. And I'm going to kick off with a quick reading from the opening of my book, Grail, which I published last year. And it was written during the first year and a half of living in Glastonbury, and seeking to interweave the Grail legends and the history behind them with little vignettes of contemporary life here in Glastonbury, and also interwoven with poetic spells or incantations, three of which I will hopefully be sharing with you during this talk. But to begin with the way in, here, Arthur and Merlin step out of the Celtic dream time, charging the landscape with mythic resonance. Joseph of Arimathea sails from the Holy Land, bearing the chalice that received the blood of Christ on the cross. On Wirral Hill, his staff takes root and flowers, becomes the Glastonbury thorn. The chalice he buries on Chalice Hill. The waters of a spring are stained red with blood. Pagan chieftains grant him 12 hides of land. He builds a wattle and daub church. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? Time opens into eternity, and Jesus is here in person with his uncle, Joseph the tin trader, the boy God initiated into the Druid mysteries. Some say that wattle church was built not by Joseph, but by the hand of God, and that Jesus dedicated it to his mother, and that the mother of God herself is buried in the ruined abbey. Or that during his missing years, Jesus returned with Mary Magdalene and their love child. And looming over all, the Tor, with its blood and white springs and Neolithic dragon lines. Here the old gods rule. Wynap Need holds court in the underworld, Anun, the fairy castle that guards the Cauldron of Inspiration. Here, ancient heathen myths merge with Christian mysticism to conceive the Holy Grail, the elusive cup that heals all ills, the source of physical sustenance and spiritual transformation. So my book Grail charts my personal quest for the Grail, and we each have our personal quest, whether we've articulated it as such or in other words. But for each of us, of course, the Holy Grail has entered our language to mean, in a sense, the key, the thing that will open and reveal the true meaning of life to us. Everyone has their own vision of the Grail. And we've already heard from some of my fellow speakers very different takes on it from what I'm about to present. And these aren't exclusive, mutually exclusive. I think that's key to understand, that there can be as many visions of the Grail as there are human beings, certainly as many as there are mystical writers, and each of them will have some qualities. So I'm not here to kind of judge or evaluate other people's theories, and I'm not here to present my own definitive theory that will explain everything. Rather, what I aim to do with this talk is to take us on a journey, and on that journey to shift our perception in subtle ways about the myth and the history behind this extraordinary legend of the Holy Grail, and ultimately to see how we can approach it through what I'm calling the poetic vision. So let's just look at some origins. There are many examples of what one might call the self-replenishing cauldron throughout the world, but particularly in our Celtic cultures of these islands and of Western Europe. The Celts strongly identified with the cauldron as one of the key symbols, really, of their whole spiritual experience. For example, in Irish myth, perhaps one of the best known is the Dagda, has the cauldron of plenty, a cauldron that will feed and sustain the entire tribe. In Welsh myth, in the Mabinogi, we have Bran, who gives his sister in marriage to an Irish king, and she is then treated very badly, and to avenge her and to avenge the dishonor done to her, Bran leads an invasion of Ireland, and there's a great battle. Unfortunately, Bran, as a wedding gift, gave a cauldron to the Irish king. And when the Irish warriors are chopped down in battle, they just throw them in the cauldron and they spring out again, ready to fight. So this is a cauldron that can renew life, can literally raise the dead. And Bran himself later is wounded in this battle. He tells his companions to cut his head off, and then they take the head on a great journey, eventually to London, where they bury it under what is now the Tower of London. On the way, they stop near Harlech on the island of Grassholm. They spent 80 years there, and it seems as if no time has passed. They're eternally happy. And this is one of the legends also from Celtic tradition that we see again and again, and will actually reinvent itself in the Grail legends as the castle of the Grail. And while we're on the subject of Welsh Celtic lore, the great Welsh bard Taliesin, his own origin myth involves the Cauldron of Inspiration, which was prepared by Ceridwen, the dark goddess, for her son, who was so utterly useless, she made him a brew to give him magical knowledge, the ability to see the future and to understand the language of birds and animals, among other things. And she gets the local village boy, Gwion Bach, to stir the cauldron. And he's under strict orders, of course, not to drink it. But while he's stirring it, 3 drops of scalding brew come onto his thumb. He sucks his thumb, and in that instant, he receives the knowledge contained in the brew. And he not only can see the future, but he can understand the language of birds. And the birds are telling him, better run, because the goddess is angry. And then there begins one of the great shape-shiftings in our literature, in which the young boy changes first into a hare, and then into an otter, and then into a bird. And the goddess gives chase as a hound. Oh, yeah, he changed into a fish, so the goddess changes into an otter, and then into a hawk to chase the bird. Finally, the boy changes into a grain of corn, hoping to hide in almost nothingness. But she changes into a hen and pecks it up and becomes pregnant with him. And 9 months later, she gives birth to the child of the shining brow, Taliesin, the archetypal bard of these islands. Taliesin, top bard. He's born already with the knowledge of many, many past lives, which begin to pour out in his poetry. And he writes many poems in his lifetime. One of the most famous also involves a cauldron. And this is the spoils of Anun. Anun. And this tells of a raid on the Celtic otherworld. And something very close to the Grail castle from pre-Christian times. It's Caercydi, the castle of glass. And in this castle is held the cauldron, and Arthur, King Arthur and companions, his war band, set off to steal the Cauldron of Inspiration, the Arwen, which I didn't identify, but for those who are not familiar, and I'm sure most of you are, this is the symbol of the Arwen, the source of poetic inspiration. The raid is to steal the Arwen. And Taliesin, the poet, is one of this company who go with Arthur, who says, "My poetry, from the cauldron it was uttered. From the breath of 9 maidens it was kindled. The cauldron of the chief of Anun, what is its fashion? A dark ridge around its border, and pearls. It does not boil the food of a coward. It has not been destined." Beautiful poetic evocation, mixing both a physical cauldron with very precise description with something much more metaphysical and symbolic. It does not boil the food of a coward. It has not been destined. This is more like perhaps our native equivalent to a Japanese koan. There isn't an easy answer to what exactly that means. It's there for us to consider its meaning. And Taliesin speaks of Caercydi, as I say, the glass castle which they are raiding here in the spoils of Anun. He speaks of it in another poem in which he says, "Perfect is my chair in Caercydi. Disease and old age cannot touch the one who dwells there." This, of course, is evoking a very familiar image in Celtic mythology, the Summerlands. We also, some of us in Ireland will have heard of Tir na Nog. These are palaces of other worlds, and when one goes there, time seems to not exist, and there's always food and drink and pleasure, delight, music. And this is, in a sense, a pre-Christian precedent for the castle of the Grail. Taliesin's own poem, "Perfect is my chair in Caercydi," is very, very beautiful. What I've tried to do as a poet often is respond to my mentors, to the greater poets who come before me in the bardic tradition. And this is one of my attempts at this. It takes that line, "Perfect is my chair in Caercydi," and responds to it in a language that I hope makes it very approachable to a contemporary audience. So, perfect is my chair in Caercydi, in the revolving castle, whose doors open not in the fixed, mapped, X-marked spots, but in the cracks, the quirks and quarks that shift their shapes to quake the castle walls. If I had to tell it to the scientist, I'd say the castle doors are chemical receptors. You key in with a twist. When you're in, you're it. Be still in the spin of the whirligig castle, cross-eyed to see the lip in the skin and key in. Next twist. If you fix on anything, you get fixed. Be nothing. In the hub of the turning castle, see what you shall see, and return in poetry. In the living heart of the spiral castle, I drink from the cauldron, warmed by the breath of 9 muses. And what I drink, I am. I am sky. I'm raven who fly me, a chuckle of sparrows, the waning moon, and the sun who seed them. And knowing that castle door is always open, not on some fabled island in the west, but close as breath and heartbeat, as hand on moss and stone. In the fairy castle I am. Perfect is my chair in Kaya City. So in this poem, I'm trying to evoke this sense of what is this chair? Here in Glastonbury, we have a chaired bard, and that is a tradition within the bardic tradition that you come together at a gorsedd and elect a bard. But I think Taliesin, speaking of his chair, is not something he wins in a competition. It's something he wins in inner space. We have a mountain in Wales where you can spend the night on the summit, and when dawn breaks, you will either be a bard or you'll be completely mad. And that is, of course, written into this bardic path. It's a perilous pathway. One thinks perhaps of parallels with the psychedelic approach to enlightenment. It can really deliver. I've personally experienced it, but it can also destroy our minds. And we need to walk lightly if we're going to tread that path. You'll notice, you may think it's a rather inappropriate illustration here rather than a more traditional image of a bardic chair. This, of course, is white Tara enthroned in the lotus throne. But when I was preparing the talk, suddenly she appeared in my sort of cache of images, and I felt that it is good to remind ourselves that the Celtic tradition, although it's very particular to our islands, it does nevertheless connect with traditions all over the world. And what I understand by Taliesin's chair, when he sat in his chair, the perfect chair, is it's a place where he is connected with all of existence, with all of consciousness, past, present, future. William Bloom, in his opening address today, spoke about, I think he ended by saying, when we're lying in bed, to think of the vastness of the universe, of a huge dragon reaching through the skies. And it's these kind of images of connectedness. So for me, this sense of our connection with all of being, this is what the Grail quest is really about. It's our search for this. So we've had some pagan and heathen antecedents, all of which show that one can enter this exalted numinous state without knowing anything about Christianity or its doctrine. But now we have the other element that produces this unique symbol of the Holy Grail. And this is the Christian legend that Joseph of Arimathea, who is credited, of course, in the conventional Gospels, the canonical Gospels of the Bible. He's the man who takes Jesus down from the cross and pleads with Pilate for his body and then buries it in his own tomb. That's all accepted as Christian orthodoxy. And then when one goes to the Gnostics and to the apocryphal Gospels, in the Gospel of Nicodemus, one learns that he used the chalice, no, actually, I'm wrong on this. This is not Nicodemus. Nicodemus does have him imprisoned and later visited by Jesus in prison. And it has a reference which is later massively amplified, which is why I just corrected myself. The reference is to this Grail, this what is often spoken of as a chalice, but we'll come to that. But he uses a receptacle, let's say for now, to catch the blood of Christ as he's dying on the cross. So there's the image that exists, at least from the 4th century, although probably in oral tradition, all of these things exist a lot longer than when they're written down. But this tradition only really erupts, and it really is an eruption, in the 12th century. Actually, in a short 50-year period, from 1180 to roughly 1230 AD, 50 years, suddenly out of nowhere, all these legends start connecting up. So you get the cauldron of the pagan Celts, the chalice, and King Arthur and his knights all begin to come together in this matrix that produces this unique myth. And it comes not in English literature, but in France. It's in French romances. And the people who wrote these romances almost certainly got a lot of their stories from troubadours, from conteurs, the minstrels who would travel from court to court, telling the stories that were the currency of the day. And clearly these were the stories they were telling, and giving each one, as always is the case, when any of us tells a story, we're going to tell it different from another person. We each have our own twist. And that's why the Grail literature, rather than being a lovely, tidy story that we can simply explain, is incredibly contradictory. There are at least 20 or 30 Grail legends, and although they agree about certain key details, they differ wildly about others. I'm just going to mention two at this stage. Robert de Boron wrote his Joseph d'Arimathie, excuse my French. This elaborates the story I referred to earlier, and where you noticed I corrected myself, because a lot of what we believe is the original story is written by Robert de Boron in the 12th century. And that is the story that Joseph took something, a plate, we think, from the Last Supper, used it to catch the blood of Christ on the cross. Remember that last image? To catch the blood of Christ and to bring it, in Robert de Boron's story, he brings it to France and to a French area, possibly French area, called the Vale of Aveyron. Aveyron. At the same time as de Boron's writing, Chrétien de Troyes is writing his Perceval, Le Conte de Grail, Percival, or the story of the Grail, really. And in this, he gives us most of the key features of the Grail story. He gives us the Fisher King, the king who is wounded and who is in need of some kind of magical healing in order for the land itself to be healed. This is a key image in the Grail legend, the Fisher King, the maimed king, the king who is married to the land, and the king is often wounded in the thighs, sometimes through both thighs, and we don't need any imagination to see this is implicitly a sexual wound. And so it's the king's potency has been struck, and as the king is struck and becomes impotent, so the land becomes sterile. This is a key sense in which pagan traditions very gently infiltrated Christian tradition. There were many more books of the Grail, some of which I'll come to later. But all in all, as I say, there were 20 or 30 books, including a very impressive cycle called the Vulgate cycle, which was all in prose, which we shall come to very soon. But meanwhile, Joseph of Arimathea, well, Blake refers to him. This is a Blake engraving. Joseph of Arimathea among the rocks of Albion. And many people would say, and did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? From Blake's famous Jerusalem poem. Actually, it's from his poem Milton, but everybody thinks it's from Jerusalem. Many people would say this refers to when Joseph the tin merchant came here with Jesus, his nephew. There is a tradition of stories in Cornwall that would seem to support that. By medieval times, the legend is spreading that Joseph of Arimathea established Christianity on these islands, that he brought the original Christian tradition here. And that the reference I made at the start, that the pagan chieftains, it was initially Arviragus, and then other pagan chiefs, gave him land, even though they decided not to convert to Christianity. And this is one very important thing to say about Glastonbury. We have a tradition where pagan traditions and Christian traditions have existed very harmoniously for 2,000 years, remarkably so, and that they have fed each other. And indeed, in the first millennium, this was the center of a kind of Celtic Christianity in which old Celtic goddesses like Bridget could be incorporated, assimilated as Bridie, and still carry some of the powers that they had. So here's Joseph preaching the gospel when he comes to this land. Our Glastonbury legend, one of many, is that he landed on Wirral Hill and climbed up the hill, and near the top he stuck his staff in the ground, which immediately put down roots and blossomed and became the Glastonbury thorn, which, as we heard in Mano's presentation earlier, it's a thorn that blossoms at Christmas and Easter twice a year. It's also native to the Middle East, so there is some evidence to suggest that this may be the real thing. As always with the Glastonbury legends, one could go either way. It's up to you, really. There's others would point out, even Geoffrey Ashe, the great Glastonbury mythology folklorist. Geoffrey pointed out that the first reference he could come to the Glastonbury thorn being the flowering of Joseph's staff was in 1716, and it was from a pub landlord speaking to a Catholic researcher. Now, that doesn't mean that there was no tradition before that, of course, but it's just interesting to unpack these things, particularly in the context of my presentation, which, remember, is talking about the poetic vision. And we'll expand on this as we go on. I just want to say for now that the poetic vision, when I use that word, I don't use it to mean something that is less than what people call reality or the rational view of the world. It's just different. It can still affect our world in powerful ways, as Joseph does. You will have seen this, those of you who saw Manu's presentation will have seen this image of Joseph from St. John's Church in Glastonbury. And you can see he's carrying two cruets, the two cruets containing the blood and the sweat of Christ. Now, this is interesting because this is recorded in 1342 by John of Glastonbury, a great chronicler. John of Glastonbury is recording a tradition that has its origins in Melkin's prophecy that the tomb of Joseph lies in the abbey, and that within the tomb he has with him these cruets of blood and sweat. Why this is so interesting, of course, is because there is no mention of the Grail. The Grail is not identified with Glastonbury, even though this is the time when the Grail stories are exploding in France. All the other elements are there, but not Glastonbury. But things are going to change soon. Here's another, this is actually a modern stained glass window. This is from St. Patrick's Chapel, also in Glastonbury, in the Abbey, for those of you who want to visit it. And it shows Joseph, again, with the two cruets. And it's interesting because clearly it's deeply related to the Grail. R.J. Stewart suggests that we interpret them symbolically. The blood and the sweat should be interpreted as the semen, the seed of Christ. And he connects this a lot with the whole idea that the Grail is indeed a story of the transmission by blood, this Gnostic idea, which of course was popularized in Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The idea perhaps that Mary Magdalene herself, her womb was the Grail through which Christ's descendants literally come into the world. So all this, as I say, is coming to a head in over 50 years, between 1180 and 1230. And as I say, not connected with Glastonbury, but in 1191, shortly after the fire that destroyed the Lady Chapel, within which was said to be the original church built by Joseph of Arimathea, immediately after the fire, about 10 years later, 15, monks dig and discover the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere, which you can still see the place in the church where they were discovered and where they were then reburied some years later in a great marble tomb. Now, of course, there's an easy way to dismiss this, which is to say the church had burnt down, they needed funds, the monks came up with this fantastic story. And indeed, Ferdinand Lot, the French Grail scholar, once called Glastonbury a laboratory of forgery for the ease with which Glastonbury produced these legends. And yet, as Geoffrey Ashe says, so many of these legends are easy to pick apart, but there's always something you can't quite get rid of. And this is true again and again. So King Arthur emerges in Glastonbury at exactly the time where all over France, people are writing down these stories about Arthur and his knights and the quest of the Holy Grail. And I've mentioned de Boron and Chrétien de Troyes, and then the Vulgate cycle, this prose cycle. The best known are the prose Lancelot, which is the third part, and the quest of the Holy Grail, the fourth part. And this would be a very good, I don't know if it was specifically done for that, but this would be a very good illustration for that specific version of the legend, because this, notice at the head, I know it's a round table, Arthur's round table, of course, deliberate so that no one was really at the head, and yet it's very clear there is a head at the table where you might expect to see King Arthur. And no, Arthur's off to one side. In fact, he's the other side of Percival. And the other side, we have, Lancelot, of course, another great Grail knight, and Gawain over here. Here, Elias is actually Alan, who is credited with being the descendant of Joseph of Arimathea, who links into Percival becoming the hero knight. In this version, this is just going to get complicated for a moment. In this version, it's Galahad is the knight, or Galad, the knight who is destined to achieve the Grail. And Galad is the son of Lancelot from an illicit liaison with the Queen of the Grail Castle, who he was under an enchantment and believed it was Guinevere that he was actually making love to. And in the process, he conceived Galahad. So although Galahad was born of Lancelot's sin, he was the pure knight who is destined to achieve the Grail. And in fact, a sign of this is he's sitting in the siege perilous, the perilous seat. And in many Grail legends, other knights try to sit in this seat and are consumed by fire or fall down into a bottomless pit. So this is clearly a dangerous place. Only the knight who is destined to achieve the Grail can sit in it. And here we have Galahad. So what we're seeing here is the fusion of Arthurian legends, which were beginning to take on a real shape, all the pagan elements that had been incorporated with Christian mysticism, and specifically with this gradual emergence of the idea of a grail. By the way, just something linguistically about the word grail, and of course, other people will interpret this differently, but the evidence is, there's a lot of linguistic evidence, the word Graal referred to a big serving platter. And this is supported by descriptions in the books, in the various books, of it having a boar's head. So clearly, although it's come down to many of us as the idea of being a cup, but you couldn't really fit a boar's head or a salmon into a cup like that. So it does suggest the Graal originally was a much more this platter that was inexhaustible. In terms of the physical body, it could feed you with all you needed, but also had a spiritual dimension to the sustenance it gave. So far, so good. The story's coming together really coherently, and all these legends are taking the shape of something that could be a mystical practice. And indeed, many people have argued that these were the secret rites of Cathars and Templars. And there's much evidence that this was a mystery school that we've kind of lost the keys to, perhaps. But then this, the high history of the Holy Grail, also known as Perlispaus, which is one of the names of Percival in this particular book. This is the book that Professor Mary Williams rightly says is most associated with Glastonbury. Indeed, near the end of the book, it actually claims that the Latin from which this book was taken, it was written in French, but the original Latin book, it claims, was in Glastonbury Abbey. And it's very specific about that. It says where Arthur and his Queen Guinevere are buried. And so here, this is the first real connection between the Grail and Glastonbury in one of maybe 30 books. It's the only one that gives us any clue that there is a link between the two. And then when you read the high history, you do start to recognize some of the landscape here. And that gives us pause for thought that, yeah, it's very, very possible. However, the high history is very problematic, and I'm just going to briefly tell you why. It doesn't present a lovely, ordered, sort of ritual, dramatic narrative that, actually has a beginning, middle, and end. It tends to be circular, and everything achieved seems to be very conditional in this book, and often to presage disaster. So it begins not with a vision that perhaps we tend to think of King Arthur as this golden age, but at the beginning of this book, the golden age is over. Arthur's become lazy, he no longer goes questing, Guinevere's getting very agitated. She wants to get him out the castle, really. Go on, go questing, for God's sake. So there's all this going on. Eventually he decides he'd better do it. The night before the quest begins, his squire dreams that he goes to a chapel and steals something. Goblet, maybe. Something a bit Grail-like. And in the process of stealing it, he's attacked by the guard and stabbed. And he wakes up telling everyone this. But when they look, he still has the knife in him. And this is an extraordinary beginning to this book, because it's really the first example I know of death during astral travel. You actually get wounded when you're astral traveling, and then you die in reality. It's very rare that to be recorded in literature. And then Arthur sets off. He announces the quest. In fact, he calls a feast, and all the knights come to a feast. And then these three damsels of the car turn up. Really strange, like the oldest one is like this crone. She's completely bald, and she's got a head, human head, decapitated. She's got another 100 outside. This is quite serious stuff. She certainly shuts up the feast. And she tells them all that basically the land is laid to waste because a certain knight didn't ask the right question. And they're now awaiting a certain knight who will come and ask the right question, or will come and achieve the Grail. And this is the beginning of the Grail quest, at which point it starts to go off into the adventures of the various knights. And particularly we follow Gawain. He goes off, he ends up in lots of different castles, all with their own enigma or riddle. Sometimes there's a knight or a dwarf or a giant that he has to fight and usually kill in very graphic detail. Sometimes there's a damsel who may or may not be in disgrace, but nearly always tries to seduce Gawain, and one way or another to claim him from his quest. And then he comes across all these relics. Again, this medieval mind was obsessed with relics of Christ. So there's the circlet of thorns, the actual crown of thorns, which is supposedly set in silver. At another time, he has to actually win the sword that decapitated John the Baptist, which is still bleeding when you take it out of the scabbard. He wins this sword by killing a giant who had killed the son of King Gurgalan. And when the son died, King Gurgalan orders that he's chopped into little pieces and boiled and fed to the entire population. So I include that as just one example of really grotesque imagery, not what you'd expect to find in a Christian allegory. This is very strange. It's almost like it's not totally digested even by the author. He's like struggling with his own subject matter. Eventually, Gawain does make it to the Grail Castle, and all the way through. Before we get there, just to mention, Arthur had a vision of the Grail in which it appeared that Our Lady was presenting the communion but as the living Christ, as the embodied Christ. So as she presents the cup, Arthur sees the child, and then in another part of the vision, he sees the crucified Christ. The Grail appears, and Gawain has been warned all the way through this story. It's one of the best jokes almost. Anyone who meets Gawain tends to say, when you finally get to the Grail, don't forget to ask the question. That's the key to the whole story. So Gawain's there, and in fact the Grail is served 3 times while he's there. And each time you've got all the other knights looking at him nervously, wanting to egg him on. Ask the question. And each time Gawain goes into a kind of trance, particularly because there's a lance, the bleeding lance that drops 3 drops of blood. And he becomes so entranced by that. He's somewhere between grace and his own frailty. He doesn't ask the question. And the same with Lancelot, except with Lancelot, he doesn't even get to see the Grail because of his impurity in his love for Guinevere, Arthur's queen. Percival, he's the man who is destined, we're told this all the way through, the knight who is destined to achieve the Grail. And yet he's not quite the Sir Galahad we might expect. Some of the people he kills, he seems to do quite wantonly. And in particular, near the end of the first of the 2 volumes, when he's about to free his mother's land. This is his mother, Grail. And she, you would expect her to be just grateful, but she actually really lays into him, tells him it was his fault that the Fisher King died because he didn't ask the right question. And then tells him, remember Solomon, who said, you know, when you deliver justice to sinners, you also need to show mercy, and unless you yourself become a sinner. And the way Percival responds to that is by he conquers his enemy. He then has many of his knights hung upside down and their throats cut, and it fills a great vat with blood. And then he drowns the commander upside down in this vat of blood. So you can see already this is not about kind of ideas of Christian charity or anything like that. This is the church militant. And indeed, this can be read, the entire text can be read as the church militant, looking to convert by the sword. And it's not pretty. I mean, you know, let's leave aside certain other elements. I mean, knights and damsels, don't necessarily stand up to feminist scrutiny today. And there's casual anti-Semitism. Really, there are many monstrous things in this book. And yet, again and again, it's as if the legend itself cannot be buried, and it keeps breaking through the legend of the Grail. Geoffrey Ashe spoke of how the Grail actually destroys lives. And it destroys Arthur's court. You know, Arthur's court is never the same again after the quest for the Grail. Some of the knights are dead. Some of Percival has left. Lancelot, their relationship is changed forever. And yet, says Ashe, there is this great compensation, because there's something in the receiving of the Grail. It's as if that God itself, the divine, is reaching through into this cruel, uncaring world and touching you with something of absolute certainty. And the question is, what is that certainty? I would suggest that it is our sense of deep, deep connectedness, the sense that the Grail is within us and is sustaining us, and the Grail is that part of the divine in humanity. Again, you see this image of the final serving of the Grail. This is, of course, a pre-Raphaelite image, Burne-Jones. And by the Victorians, the Grail had once more been codified in a form that we could accept. Here's Tennyson. Now, Tennyson, of course, got a lot of his stuff from Malory, Thomas Malory, medieval poet, English poet, who got his stuff from The Quest of the Holy Grail, which was the French Vulgate. And here, remember, this is the 19th century. According to Geoffrey Ashe, this is the first time ever that the Grail is specifically connected with Glastonbury in the 19th century. So just to give us an understanding of this, and indeed, more broadly, when I speak of the importance of the poetic imagination and saying it's not a lesser form. So, for example, the legend of Jesus and Mary and their child coming here, that's a very late 20th century, really, idea. It may have existed in previous ages, but really it only fully takes shape in the late 20th century. So this, in the late 19th century, we have the good Saint Arimathean Joseph journeying brought to Glastonbury. And then we have the Winterthorn legend and the Grail legend, the cup itself, from which our Lord drank at the last sad supper with his own. And as you see, by then it's become the cup, although a medieval audience wouldn't have understood that. And then it meets the modernists. So in the 1920s, or just before that, Jessie Weston, from ritual to romance, she traces the development of this Christian mystical symbol from ancient pagan rites, and particularly emphasizes this idea of the divine kingship, of the king who is married to the land. And if the king, therefore, is infirm in any way, loses his power, then the land is laid to waste, the wasteland. And this became the inspiration for perhaps the best known modernist poem, the best known poem of the 20th century, The Wasteland. And Eliot openly admitted that he was inspired for everything, for the title and the form, and a lot of the ideas in The Wasteland are drawing on Jessie Weston's understanding of the Grail as a sort of transition symbol, or as the last remnant of old fertility rites. I'm just going to, okay, I've got to keep it moving now. So I will move fast. 1922, almost 100 years ago, the Reverend Lionel Smithett Lewis preaches a sermon claiming that St. Joseph founded Glastonbury Abbey, and then publishes this book. And in this book, he pulls together many of the legends from the past and seeks to give authorities for them. It has to be said that many scholars have seriously criticized his sources, because he's a bit loose with his sources, is Lionel. Only a few years later, and remember this is also the time where Dion Fortune was here and Bly Bond doing spiritualist work. And then in 1930s, we get John Cowper Powys, A Glastonbury Romance. It was of interest to me because there's a John Crow in there that I didn't even know about till I came here and read the book. But what's particularly interesting is there's 47 major characters, and all of them in some way experience the Grail in different ways, and in ways that some wouldn't recognize, perhaps as a Grail vision. The only explicit Grail vision comes from Sam Decker, who actually sees the Grail as a fish, well, as a cup, but with a fish swimming in it, which I think is a very beautiful image. Around the same time, an American, well, she's not American, actually she's born here, but lived in Canada and also traveled in America. Catherine Maltwood was living at the Priory, some of you may know, and she had been commissioned to illustrate the high history of the Holy Grail, the book that I spent some time talking about. And she was going to try and link the journeys of Arthur's knights to the landscape in Glastonbury. And she was looking at a map of Somerton when suddenly, out of the natural topographical features, the figure of a lion leapt out at her. And in no time at all, she was seeing images from the zodiac, Gemini, a child in a boat, and Sagittarius was an interesting kind of centaur-like figure being stung by Scorpio. Here we have the lion over Somerton. This she's claiming for Virgo as a sort of witch, if you see an upside-down witch. And here's also upside down, sort of the body of the figure, kind of a centaur, being stung by a scorpion, which she claimed for Arthur. That is Arthur going into his decline. Now, as you can see already, one needs to be generous to say, oh yeah, that's it, definitely. But nevertheless, there's something there. When it was published, I mean, she was mocked mercilessly. And it's quite easy to make fun of Catherine Maltwood because, for example, her philology is a bit dodgy. She often, the derivation of words. So there was a river Paruti in Sumeria, and she says, well, we've got the river Parrot. So obviously they're the same. But, you know, people who study these things tell us it doesn't work quite like that, just because it sounds like. Doesn't mean it is. Of course, it doesn't absolutely mean it isn't. The biggest criticism made of Maltwood was that many of the features, natural features that draw these images, and they are giant, remember, giant earth effigies, many of them are recent. I mean, some 20th century field patterns have changed. And so people found it very easy to mock her. And yet, as I say, as with all Glastonbury legends, there is something there. Now, there are some people, probably some people in this room, who genuinely believe that this was built 2,700 years ago by Sumerians. 2,700 BC by Sumerians. So this is an astonishing claim, but who's to say it isn't true? What I would say is the way legends work is we interpret them according to our own need, where we are in our own journey, our own psychic temperament. And some people need legends to know that they're almost literally true. The Star Temple really exists. You can go and walk it. And my attitude to that is, if that connects you, if that makes you feel connected with the stars and the earth, then it's clearly working and it's not to be mocked in any way. My own temperament is different. My temperament is to see this as a poetic vision. And I've often said as a joke, well, you know, if it wasn't there before Catherine Maltwood, it is now. Because I think once you envision something and that vision is shared by others, what are we? We are people who pattern reality. This is what human beings do. We see patterns where otherwise there is only chaos or a total overload of impressions. We give meaning to life. And one of the principal ways we give meaning is through our stories, through our myths and legends. And so really, you know, always through history, you see it with Christians. There are fundamentalists, and there are people who say, no, it's all symbolic. You don't have to take it literally. And equally, in the New Age and in the world of legends and myths, all of us exist. And actually, the trick is perhaps not to seek to dominate, say, oh, my vision is the correct one. The trick is to actually learn to live really together. The one criticism I do have of literalism for myself is I find that if you take things very literally, sometimes they can become a block. What should be the key becomes the lock. And I see that sometimes in some of the interpretations of the Star Temple. For example, when Maltwood or Mary Cain, her great disciple, who's a wonderful poet as well, but occasionally they'll say things like, but this is the round table. This is the Holy Grail. This is Caiacidi, Taliesin's glass castle. I think to do that is to reduce it, is to say, oh, we've explained it. And to me, in the poetic vision, the whole point is it cannot be explained. In fact, when it does get too explained, it ends up becoming something almost comical. And here we have the Monty Python knights cowering. But even Monty Python can't totally bury the legend. For all it's set out, of course, to take the piss out of the whole story. And yet, there are moments where the Grail is about to appear that I find genuinely numinous. And I would also say that you remember the Black Knight, the one who they chop bits off, and he never gives up. Even eventually there's just a torso wriggling on the ground saying, come on, come on. And in a way, that character would fit very well in the high history of the Holy Grail. I kid you not. That's exactly the sort of character. But rather than fixate, perhaps, on a cup, and, you know, some people will want to. People do go up the Tor looking for, or to Chalice Well, hoping to find this chalice or cup or whatever. And as I say, I'm not here to criticize that, simply to say that there are other ways too. And so we might envision, here's William Blake again, a great influence on my own work. And you could say that's a vision of the Grail. In many ways, that is a transforming vision in which imagination is actually filling the world with that sense of divinity and consciousness, really, entering matter in such a powerful way. And if you look at that and then this, you see that that's another Blake, and this is almost moon to the previous one's sun. But again, there's that incredible sense of the human singing out. And I think this is something we get in the Grail. We recognize something of the human, and yet it is also something utterly transcendent. It's a true liminal. It's a portal. And so when we look for symbols of the Grail, here we have our own chalice well, where some believe Joseph buried the Grail. But wells are anyway portals between the worlds, and they're places of healing. So that's chalice well, of course, at spring equinox this year. And they are beautiful. It's a beautiful image in itself, to me, of the Grail. For 23 years, I worked at Crossbones Graveyard with my wife Katie and the Friends of Crossbones to reclaim what was a brutalized site awaiting redevelopment. And we've reclaimed it as a garden of remembrance for sex workers and outcasts, for they are the people who are buried here. And things that just appeared spontaneously, really. And one of the things that appeared through our working with a mysterious spirit embodied was this pond. And here Katie's photographed the Shard, the London Shard, which is just there, reflected. And to me, that's also a wonderful image of the Grail, because it's the Grail is clearly a very feminine energy. It's a receptive energy. And this is, to me, a lovely example of a sort of tantric triangle catching this very phallic male image and taming it and making it actually beautiful. And of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe with her nimbus, which again suggests to me something of the Grail. And clearly Our Lady is a huge part of this. I mentioned only briefly in passing Mary Magdalene as the womb through which maybe Jesus' descendants might be conceived of passing. And clearly Mary Mother as the womb through which Jesus comes can also be regarded as a Grail. And Mary Mother is, of course, evoked and invoked in many animist traditions, which go far beyond what Christianity would claim for her. 5 minutes, and I haven't even touched on my trip to Glastonbury, but this is how the Grail is, and that's fine, because I don't want to talk about myself. I'll just talk about myself for 5 minutes then. And here's my book, which embodies the Grail in my own way. This is actually Katie did this rubbing in St. John's Church, and it's a very simple, just a cup really, but I love it as a Grail image. And as you can see, it's suffused with light there. Their friend sent me that picture. I love the idea of it, suffused with light. The Grail charts my first year and a half living in Glastonbury. I'd just completed a 23-year magical work at Crossbones Graveyard in South London, where I'd lived half my life. I was working with my spirit guide, the Goose, and having completed the work, I asked the Goose, show us where we should be. And she brought us here. We came here for a week, and by the end of that week, we'd found a place, and 6 weeks later, we were living here. And everybody has amazing stories of how we get to Glastonbury. It was very kind to me, and it really made me feel wanted. I would say also, I found I was living very near the Dodd line, identified by John Michel, who was a good friend of mine and a big influence. And even that we were living in a street formerly known as Groat Cunt Lane, the old red light district, which was very significant given that I'd asked the Goose, the spirit of a medieval sex worker, to find us a new home. So, these things do work. Magic works. That's my message of the day, really. I asked the Goose. We came just between lockdowns. And so during the second lockdown that winter, Glastonbury was completely quiet, but the shops were beautiful, of course. And I asked the Goose to introduce me to the local spirits. So we walked around talking to the native spirits. And one night, the 30th of December, 2020, which was a blue moon, I asked her for a spell to open the pathways into Glastonbury. And she gave me 3. And if I can push it, my 5 minutes, I will now do them because they're very short. Here's me invoking those spells in Glastonbury Abbey. It's very important to me as a magical work. I've done a lot of work. And of course, the Abbey doesn't really like ceremonies, but we were just a bunch of Blakeans there, sharing our love for the Master. This is the poem I was evoking in that last picture, and I'm going to share it with you now. Because and I'll just say very briefly, I've tried to give a sort of intellectual breakdown of the Grail myth and show how it's part history, part legend, but above all, it's inspired, it's lit up by the poetic imagination. And this is my own small attempt as a poet to respond to that material, particularly with the idea that all these things should work together, that we don't have to see the Abbey and the Tor as enemies, or Christianity and paganism. We can actually see that things work in their own places, and in their own place, they're fine. So this, a little spell of unforgetting, a clamour, bleeding lances and the beat of the tambour. Out of the ruin the earth calls time. No more, no more, let false enchantment beguile this ravished land. The time of the remembering is at hand. By the elemental cauldron, hollowed deep within the Tor, Win-up Need is opening the door. Merlin casts upon the waters, dragons writhing in the deep, as on the Isle of Avalon we sleep. In a boat of fog and fairy, gliding on the glassy lake, Arthur dreams the dream wherein we wake. By the full moon, Joseph plants the chalice in the mud, and lo, the stream that wells there flows with blood. Our Lady in her chapel unfolds God's female part in a pulse of love to open up the heart. Here the Christ child dances in each life to reveal the work and the play and the way for this broken world to heal. Then every stricken healer in the shadow of the Tor, let the Grail replenish and restore. In the gone forever bell tower, the bells their changes ring. The many voices of the one perpetual choir sing. The one made many, the consort, their songs of liberty light up the unconditioned mind in time, eternity. It's not the end of my slideshow, but I'm going to end there, or at least give you a choice. You can either have a few questions if we've got time, or you can have one more short poem. It's your choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are over the hour, actually.
I'm over the hour, so
Yeah,
I'm off, am I?
Well, yeah. How quick is the poem then?
Well, the poem's very quick.
Let's do it. Go on.
Let's do it.
And I
One brief plug, my books and the CD that this poem is performed on, and the last one, are over there, if anyone's interested. But for now, so this is an attempt,
because no one can describe the Grail. We can't reduce it to one thing. This is just an attempt to evoke it, not it. There are no words to contain it. Even the word that was with it and was it in the beginning, before words were. The boundless finger pointing at itself, at no self. Still, myriad names and forms to furnish the suspicion that somewhere in there, which is everywhere and nowhere, is something like a personality working to perfect itself in us, our bit of it be with us. only taken literally, even a personal avatar, has been known to divide us from it and it from itself, from no self. The wonder of it is we are it, sensing and sensed, here to know and love itself in us and through us, and for us to receive and amplify and share it around, knowing that if it's me, it must be you too. We're all it, nothing of it that's not it. So feel free to be it and call it as you will, according to your place in it. When I'm so deep in it, I am it, deep in trance. I call it, it calls itself. Its no self says, let's dance.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.